For those of you who may not know me, I'm Nicole Babby. I'm the Membership and Programs Director here for the Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation. The Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation is a membership-based organization. We were established in 1977 to promote the preservation and enhancement of the architectural, cultural, and landscape heritage of Saratoga Springs. And we do this through educational programs like this. And we also have strolls starting in June, going to the end of October. So you have to check those out as well. And then we also provide owners of historic buildings with technical assistance, advocate for best preservation practices within the city, comment on exterior changes and new construction within the city, as well as undertake restoration projects like the Spirit of Life at Spencer Trask Memorial, First Baptist Church, and our current rehabilitation at 65 Viola Street. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, that preservation doesn't just happen, it takes a lot of effort. So our organization is critical in helping with that in Saratoga Springs. As I mentioned at the start, we're a membership-based organization. So if you're not already a member, please feel free to join us. You can show your support for preserving Saratoga Springs by becoming a member, and you'll receive advance notice of events and discounts on programs. You can also visit our website, and I'll throw that in the chat in a little bit. And I am sure that many of you have seen our communications about the rehabilitation at 65 Viola Street, but for those who may not be aware, the foundation purchased the building in May of 2021. There we go. We purchased the building in May of 2021, and we're rehabilitating this building that we had been advocating for over 20 years. The scope of this project includes environmental remediation, completing necessary structural repairs, and installing a new roof. In addition, the rehabilitation will include repairing and painting the clapboard, as well as restoring windows and the front porch. Once the building is stabilized and the exterior is restored, we will sell it to someone who will complete the interior and be a good steward for years to come. And any proceeds from the sale will enable us to take on other special projects that will benefit the community. So I will drop a link in a little bit to support that and learn more about that effort. And the other thing that I want to quickly mention is that to save the date for our largest fundraiser of the year, which is the Historic Homes Tour. We're offering it again in person and virtually. And this takes place on the east side of Saratoga Springs. And there are 9 locations this year, so it will be quite the tour. And we plan to have tickets available for purchase, fingers crossed, by the end of the day tomorrow. And you definitely don't want to miss out this year. It's going to be a great tour. And we also have 2 wonderful educational programs lined up. So keep an eye on our website, because we will have full details soon about all of that. Okay, I think I've plugged everything I needed to plug, so let's get to tonight's program. If you have any questions or anything, we will address all of those at the end, but throw them in the chat, and I will keep track of all of that. So now I will introduce Nancy. So one of our presenters for tonight is Nancy Bayard Brown, and she grew up in Johnstown, New York, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born, married, and inspired. She's an original incorporator and founder of the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Hometown Association and serves as its current co-chair. She's author of the Walk in Her Footsteps cell phone tour, highlighting sites of importance in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's life in Johnstown. And in addition to serving on the board of the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites, Nancy is the marketing chair for the National Votes for Women's Trail. She does a lot. And after a 20-year career in advertising copywriting, she became a 5th grade teacher for the Gloversville Large School District. Her passion for women's history is a product of her undergraduate education at Simmons College, an all-women's college in Boston, as well as being the mother of 3 daughters and the grandmother to a granddaughter. So Nancy, I will let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It is my privilege to introduce you tonight to the National Votes for Women Trail, which is a project of the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. And interestingly enough, the National Votes for Women Trail was introduced by Hillary Clinton when she was a senator in 2007, and introduced as legislation. The legislation passed, and it sounded terrific, except for that no funds were ever appropriated, and the legislation, the bill died. And however, with it, the National Collaborative just couldn't bear to see the whole idea die, and the importance of documenting the fight for women's suffrage finally led us to, in 2016, to launch a volunteer effort to create a virtual trail of women's history sites around the country where the suffrage story can be told, and especially shining a light on underrepresented suffragists, of which there are many. Slowly but surely, as the National Votes for Women Trail network grew and our coordinators grew, so did the sites on our searchable database. And as the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment came around, the goal, we decided to set a goal of documenting 2,020 sites by 2020. Not only did we meet that goal, but we're currently over 2,400 sites on our database, which is at NVWT, National Votes for Women Trail.org. So along the way, the William G. Pomeroy Foundation of Syracuse, New York, recognized the importance of this and offered to donate 210 historical roadside markers, which took our virtual trail and gave it a physical component. And we're very grateful for that generous gift. As a matter of fact, here in Saratoga, we were able to unveil 2 markers just this summer. One of the most important things most interesting thing that has been a part of this National Votes for Women Trail journey have been the stories that have been uncovered. And Saratoga is really a great example of that. We all seem to know that Saratoga is the turning point in the American Revolution, but interestingly enough, it plays a very big part in the women's revolution as well. As far back as 1855, suffrage leaders being very strategic thinkers and recognizing that there were a lot of opinion leaders here in Saratoga, held an early women's rights conference. And it took place at St. Nicholas Hall, which stood at the north corner of Fila and Broadway. 600 persons were reported to attend both the afternoon and the evening sessions, and Susan B. Anthony, Sarah Pellet, and Matilda Joslyn Gage were the featured speakers. The convention was so successful that they came back in 1855, and the Daily Saratogian reported that the large hall was quite well filled, notwithstanding an admission fee of 25 cents a session, or 75 cents the whole course. So one of the most important things to happen here was in 1869, when Matilda Joslyn Gage called for a convention here to establish a state suffrage organization. And that convention took place on July 13th and 14th, and it was held at Congress Hall. There were 100 delegates, including some of the biggest names in the suffrage movement of the time. And that was the birth of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association. That goes on to play not only a huge role in women getting the vote in 1917 in New York, but in the United States in 2020. It was a pivotal organization. So here to tell you more about Matilda Joslyn Gage is the founder and executive director of the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation and Center for Social Justice Dialogue in Fayetteville, New York, Dr. Sally Roesch Wagner. Dr. Wagner was awarded one of the first doctorates in the country for her work in women's studies and is the founder of one of the first college-level women's studies programs in the United States. She currently serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Syracuse University Renee Crown University Honors Program. And Dr. Wagner is a noted author of a number of books, including the women's suffrage movement, which is wonderful. She was selected as one of 21 leaders for the 21st century by Women's E-News in 2015, as well as being named a 2020 New York State Senate Woman of Distinction. So it is my privilege to welcome Dr. Sally Roesch Wagner this evening.
Thank you, Nancy. That is such exciting work that you're doing with the collaborative and as Mary Baird, a historian, I think in the 1930s, said, repopulating history. And thank you for doing that work. It's really monumental. You know, I wanted to take a look at some of the information about Saratoga and the importance, as you said, of the city in the women's suffrage movement. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit on the three conventions that you point to, but also talk a little bit about some other things as well. As early as 1836, Ernestine Rose, who had recently moved to the United States, became a major figure in the women's movement for a period of time, came to Saratoga. Now, she was speaking in several different places in the state, but I think that her reason was to gather signatures on a petition for a Married Women's Property Act. Women had no existence legally at the time. State constitutions and the legal foundation of the common law said that women were dead in the law. They ceased to exist legally once they married. And one of the things was that you had no right to your possessions. Anything you brought into the marriage or anything you earned or inherited became the property of your husband to do as he wished. And she, as early as 1836, was gathering petitions, including from do you call them Saratogians? Is that the correct term? I don't want to refer to you inaccurately. Now, the Married Women's Property Act didn't pass in New York State until 1848, the summer of 1848, actually just shortly before the Seneca Falls Convention in July. In 1854, before the convention in Saratoga, there was an Albany Convention, and Susan B. Anthony presented a paper that had been prepared by Judge William Hay of Saratoga, who figures principally in the women's suffrage movement. I think we need to repopulate the suffrage movement, not just with the amazing women, but also with the men who stood up to convention at the time and really supported and strengthened women's rights. And Judge Hay, as an attorney, was very important in clarifying the needs that women had legally, as you'll see in some of the stories that I'm telling. He, in 1854, in this paper that Susan B. Anthony delivered, said that women shall exercise the right of suffrage and be eligible to all offices, occupations, and professions, entitled to act as jurors, eligible eligible to all public offices, that courts of conciliation shall be organized as peacemakers, that a law shall be enacted extending the masculine designation in all statutes of the state to females. In other words, absolute equality for women. Judge Hay of Saratoga is calling for this in 1854. And it was important that he wrote the speech for Susan B. Anthony. She really was not a writer. She said that when I put pen to paper it feels like I'm on stilts. She had a writer's block that was legendary. And we know that in the 1850s, Susan B. Anthony was delivering speeches that had been written for her by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But I think we need to remember also that she was delivering at least one speech that was written by Judge Hay of Saratoga. Now, if we get to the Saratoga Convention in 1854, the reason it was held there when Susan B. Anthony organized it was because there were two national conventions that were being held in Saratoga at the time. And it always was wise, and they did this consistently throughout the 1850s, really through the Civil War, until the Civil War, I'm sorry, that they would have conventions consecutively. So the abolition conventions would be held at the same time as the women's rights conventions. It just made sense. People didn't have to travel to two conventions. So Susan B. decided, well, these people are going to be here. Let's do a convention for women's rights as well. So she had it all organized, and then it began to fall apart. Participant after participant, speaker after speaker, told her that they couldn't attend. And so she was frantic when she found uh, Matilda Joslyn Gage and Sarah Pellet were in Saratoga. Matilda sent home for a speech, and she got it quickly, and she was able to deliver it. And it was, I need to say, Judge Hay, the Honorable William Hay, we find once again coming to the rescue when Susan B. Anthony thought, we can't do it, we can't do it. Judge Hay said, no, come on, we'll do it. And I think he, behind the scenes, was probably helping. And the hall, St. Nicholas Hall, as Nancy said, was well filled, and they made $300 at the door. And I want to read to you Judge Hay's description of Matilda Joslyn Gage's speech, which was published in Frederick Douglass's North Star, the paper that he published in Rochester. I do want to do a shout out to Frederick Douglass at this point. 1847, he began his newspaper. Now, this is a year before Seneca Falls, the convention. The masthead of his paper was, right is of no sex, truth is of no color. He put the cause of women's rights ahead of his own. This is in 1847. So he published the description of Gage's speech that Judge Hay sent to him. I will read it now. And I want you to think about this in terms of what's going on at the time and how people might have responded to this. Mrs. Gage, whose address was an elaborate argument for the removal of women's social and legal disabilities, among other authorities she quoted with judgment, was the following from William Story. Quote, in respect to the powers and rights of married women, the law is by no means abreast the spirit of the age. Here are seen the old fossil prints of feudalism. The law relating to women tends to make every family a barony, a monarchy, or a despotism, of which the husband is the baron, king, or despot, and the wife the dependent, the serf, the slave. That this is not always the fact is not due to the law, but to the enlarged humanity, which spurns the narrow limits of its rules. For if the husband choose, he has his wife as firmly in his grasp and domination as the hawk has the dove upon whom he has pounced. This age is ahead of the law. Public opinion is a check to legal rules on this subject, but the rules are feudal and stern. It cannot, however, be concealed that the position of woman is, turn the page, always the criterion of the freedom of the people or an age. And when man shall despise that right, which is founded only on might, woman will be free to stand on an equal level with him, a friend and not a dependent. Now, what she's talking about here is the Blackstone Code that was adopted by the founding fathers against the advice and wishes of Abigail Adams when she said, unless particular care and concern is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion. Well, this is the rebellion that she predicted, because the law gave women absolute dependence on men and absolute non-entity. Not only did the husband have right to any possessions of his wife, he had right to the children. A husband could will away an unborn child on his deathbed. And there were cases of this where a husband is dying, he writes his will, and his wife is pregnant, and he says, upon the birth of this child, it will be given to another person as the guardian. And the mother had absolutely no right to her own child. That child would be ripped from her arms and given to its rightful owner. A woman had no right to the safety of her body. As long as he did not inflict permanent injury, a husband had the right to beat his wife because she was to be obedient to him. In the marriage ceremony, she promised to obey. He had, now, this one I'm going to push your button a little bit here. This may be uncomfortable, but he had the right to rape her. The rape laws read an act of unlawful sexual intercourse with someone other than the wife of the perpetrator. And when Judge Blackstone explained this, he said, well, you can't rape yourself because the two shall become one and the one is the man. Gage, she said the source of this actually is the Bible. It's the Christian teaching in Genesis, the story of Eve, that as punishment for her sin of eating the apple of wisdom and encouraging her husband to do the same, that she would give birth in pain and sorrow and be under the authority of her husband. And that is not just in the Old Testament, that's all the way to the New Testament throughout the Bible, that women are to be under the authority of men. Gage said, this canon law, then the two shall become one and the one is the man, becomes common law. And that is why we have no legal existence. So Judge Hay went on to say about Gage's speech, Mrs. Gage also, and with like effect, cited from the same learned jurist laws which, had her lecture been a sermon, might have been prefixed as a text. Such opinions, although but seldom known to any but lawyers, and not appreciated by many of them, have frequently been printed in books, which, however, being professional, are perused by few persons only. I think this really gets at Gage's incredible scholarship. I think at one point, Susan B. Anthony said, I have never known a woman with a legal mind like Matilda Joslyn Gage. She had only a year of formal education, of course, went through the public school system, but that would go until 8th grade. And then she went on to 1 year beyond that. So she was really a self-taught woman. And then Judge Hay goes on to describe the gossip of mustached dandies and the half-suppressed giggle of bedizened beauty soon settled down into respectful attention, if not appreciation. Indeed, many of the most intelligent hearers, before retiring, audibly confessed that they came to find fault, but had seen nothing to censure. So some who came to scoff remained to applaud. With such advocates, there can be no retrogression of women's rights. Equality is their motto, and onward their destiny. And if you want to know what Gage was wearing, the Daily Saratogian said that Mrs. Matilda Joslyn Gage, a medium-sized, ladylike looking woman, dressed in a tasty plum-colored silk with 2 flounces. And she made the first address upon some of the defects in the marriage laws, quoting Story, Kent, and Blackstone. Vice presidents of this convention, among them were Augusta A. Wiggins of Saratoga Springs, and the Honorable William Hay was on the business committee. So this was so successful, this convention, that they decided that they would repeat it the following year. And it was held again in St. Nicholas Hall. And again, it had notable speakers, more this time. And I want to tell you a little bit about how it was conducted. Martha Wright was the chair of this convention. And at the opening, she made a brief statement of the object of the convention and then invited all those who were opposed to our demands to come to the platform and state their objections. This was something that was done in the women's rights conventions, is that they invited often the opponents to come up and join them to state their views and then to have a dialogue about the ideas. Now, this is an interesting thing. Reverend Samuel J. May, who actually delivered the first women's rights sermon probably in the country in 1845, again, 3 years before Seneca Falls. He was a Unitarian minister in Syracuse, New York. And he spoke at this convention, and he was constantly interrupted by the audience. The description of it is, it was a novelty to hear women speak, and the audience, having assembled for that purpose, preferred to listen to woman's pathetic statements of her wrongs than to the most gifted orators that men could boast. It was not until after repeated requests for order from the president and assurances from several of the ladies that they would not speak until Mr. May had finished his remarks, that quiet was restored. At the close of almost every speech, someone on the floor asked questions or stated some objections, which were quickly answered and refuted by the speakers in the most pleasant conversational manner. This is really, this is kind of a model for us, isn't it? You invite the opponent to come up, and then you give your counter argument, and you do this in a conversational, pleasant manner. Another description is there were many Southern people always at Saratoga. This was considered a grand opportunity. Through tracts, they printed these women's rights tracts with their arguments on them. Gage's was number 2 in this series of tracts that they published in the 1850s. And this convention afforded a new theme for conversation at the hotel and was discussed for many days after with levity or seriousness to be laughed over and thought over by the women at their leisure. Then how was it received by the press? Well, the usual attacks were made, accusing the members of infidelity and free love. The New York Tribune printed letters from Antoinette Brown, that refuted these arguments. Um, the close of the convention, Charles Colby, who's another man that we need to venerate and be grateful to, he invited an excursion for those who'd taken part in the meetings. He invited them to take a drive to the lake a few miles out of Saratoga, gave them a bountiful repast, and together they spent a day rich in pleasant memories. Mr. Hovey made one of the largest donations to the women's rights movement, a bequest at his death. Now, what was the long-term effect of this convention? Well, 20 years after the 1855 convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met a lady in Texas who told her about the Saratoga Convention. She said her attention was first called to the subject of women's rights by some tracts a friend of hers, then living in Georgia, brought home at that time, and that we could form but little an idea of the intense interest with which they were read and discussed by quite a circle of ladies who plied her aunt with innumerable questions about the convention and the appearance and manners of the ladies who led the movement. 1862, want to jump to that year, when there was Judge John Willard of Saratoga County, who was a member of the state Senate, and he was the author of the Act of 1862. Now, this has sometimes been criticized as a regression, a taking away some of the rights that women got in the Married Women's Property Act. But Judge Hay said his object, as I have always understood it, was to simplify, make clear, consistent, and practical some of the legislation in regard to married women. In other words, he just cleaned up the act. I think of 60, it had been revised, but there was a lot of unnecessary language in it that could have been misinterpreted legally. Now, I want to read you, this is very long, and I may not read the whole thing, but Nancy has laid out what happened in 1869. 1869, the National American and the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association was formed the following year. This was a result of the conflict that happened in the American Equal Rights Society. They initially had the goal, after the Civil War, of establishing universal suffrage for African Americans and for women. But the compromise, as you know, was that, we simply can't get suffrage for both, so we will just get suffrage for African American men. Well, the National Women's Suffrage Association said, no, we're going to work for a women's suffrage amendment. They were going to work and plan to work nationally for a federal amendment, the American for a state amendment. But what the national did was to hold state conventions to form state auxiliaries to the National Women's Suffrage Association. And Gage called one in Saratoga in 1869. So I want to just read you a little bit of this because the language is just fun. The advocates of women's suffrage have fairly earned the title of revolutionists by their recent bold move on the enemy's stronghold. The great foe to progress is want of thought, and the devotees of fashion are about the last to come into line and work for any great reform. Not a little surprise. And of course, that's, because Saratoga was a watering place and that's where people came. I mean, you know that. You're from Saratoga, many of you. But not a little surprise and some indignation were expressed by the representatives of Upper Tendom sojourning here, that strong-minded women were not only coming to Saratoga, but actually intending to hold a convention. What next? What place would henceforth be safe from the assaults of these irrepressible Amazons of reform? Saratoga has survived the shock, however. Flora McFlimsy has looked in the face of Miss Anthony and has not been turned to stone. More than that, finding the convention pouring into the parlors of Congress Hall and escape actually cut off, Flora, after deliberating whether to faint and be carried out or gratify her curiosity by looking on, finally submitted gracefully to the inevitable and did the latter. From her crimson cushioned armchair by the window, she saw the meeting called to order, saw one after another of those horrid women whose names are in the newspapers quietly taking their places, doing the thing proper to be done, and carrying forward the business of the meeting. That goes on in the same tone, but I will end it there. Actually, let me just read the final paragraph of it. In its present condition, Saratoga realizes one's ideal of a summer resort. And yet, in the good time coming, we can imagine an improvement that even Congress Hall, with its gentlemanly and courteous proprietor, its sumption appointments and army of waiters, may yet have added an excellence when, by the possession of the ballot, woman becomes a possible proprietor and actual worker, when to earn money is as honorable for a woman as now it is for a man. We may hope to find in every hotel not only a host, but a hostess. And whatever may be said of the excellence of men as housekeepers, I confidently predict that even Congress Hall will be vastly improved by the addition. Well, I think I'm going to end it there, and then we'll have time for some questions and comments. And do we have some questions, Nicole?
We don't have any questions in the chat box, but everyone can feel free to chime in, type in your questions. If you want to unmute, you're welcome to do that as well.
Okay, well, I'll just keep going until there are questions.
Keep going, I'll interrupt.
I'm sorry, what?
I'll interrupt if we get any questions in the chat.
Oh, please do. Yeah, let me know. Well, this is simply me. This reflects nothing of the opinions of the the organizers of this event. But I really want to just I'm in a state of celebration tonight. It feels like today was a trifecta of social justice. Um, Oh, thank you, Pat. But today is going to be an historic day. And I think it's, I think of it as a trifecta. And I want to talk about this because I think there's a way in which we can look at ourselves in this historic moment and get a sense of where we might have been in the suffrage issue. What happened today? First of all, the Pope rescinded the doctrine of discovery. The papal bulls that were issued at about the time of Columbus that said that if Christians didn't inhabit the land, it wasn't inhabited. And that led to the wholesale taking of indigenous land across the world. There's indigenous people have been calling on the Pope to rescind this series of papal bulls, and this is the day in which the Pope rescinded it. That is a major victory for human rights. Second, Donald Trump was indicted. Now, whatever your political beliefs are, if this jury of his peers decided that a crime was committed, this is a triumph of democracy, that if the law does not apply to everyone equally, we don't live in a democracy. And today, democracy was strengthened. And the third thing is that the attempt of the governor of Florida, DeSantis, to silence Disney World and the Disney Corporation uh, in their support of LGBTQ rights uh, was stymied by the board, and the Disney Corporation, Disney World will continue to support LGBTQ rights. Now, these are controversial, right? You may not agree with me that these are steps in the movement toward freedom and social justice. But I want to refer this back to suffrage. If you were a suffragist in 1854, you would likely sit in your church and hear that women should be under the authority of men. And if women voted, if they stood man's equal at the poll, at the ballot box, that God's divine plan would be destroyed. God's plan of women being under the authority of men. So, was that comparable to what might happen in a church today about LGBTQ rights? In some denominations, yes. In other denominations in the 1850s, like Samuel J. May's Unitarian Church, you would have heard a woman's rights sermon. I think, a question that we ask ourselves is, what position would I have held? Where would I have come down on the issue of women's right to vote? What we know is that in 1850, a majority of women in the country opposed women's right to vote. And it was a long fight for women to be able to, because if you stood for women's rights, some of it does depend on your position and age. Yes, Pat, you're right. Um, but if you would have been a suffragist during that time, you would have been in the press, you would have been mocked in the press. You would have lost your social position in many ways, that you might have lost friends, your family might have disowned you. And you probably were standing up against the dominant religions at the time. So unless we are supporting issues that put us on the edge of social justice today, likely as we wouldn't have been suffragists. I ask myself that every day. Do I deserve to think of myself as someone who would have been a suffragist? And unless I'm fighting for social justice every day, I can't say I would have been. So I wanted to share that thought with you today as I'm celebrating. Here's to the long fight, take nothing for granted. Yes, and the long fight. Matilda Joslyn Gage said, we are not going to see the results of our efforts in our lifetime. She said, we have to be willing to give up everything. She said, friends, family, in order to make the fight. But we are planting the winter wheat, and those who come after us will enter into the harvest. And I think that is true today, that we see that rights that were won can be quickly taken away from us, and that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, that we have to be constantly prepared to regain the ground that we've made. But sometimes in the moment of backlash, one of the things I think is that we can really judge how far we have come by how strong the backlash is against the rights that we've gained. And I think that we're celebrating in this moment tremendous victories that we see in uh, the backlash. Could you speak to the effort to pass I think that ERA, is that, I'm assuming the ERA? Yeah. 100 years later. This is the comparison that I live with. I'm in Onondaga territory, the center of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. It was founded 1,000 years ago on the shores of Onondaga Lake. And for 1,000 years, the clan mothers have chosen and nominated, chosen, held in position, and removed, if necessary, the chiefs that represent the clan in the council. The women clan mothers are the eyes and ears. The chiefs are the voice of the people. It's a balance of authority. 1,000 years these women have had political voice and continue to. 100 years of women having a political voice in the United States of America. 1,000 years, 100 years, 2020. And 2023, 100 years after the Equal Rights Amendment was first introduced, we do not have equal rights guaranteed in the Constitution of the United States. There's a push to get Congress to just simply get rid of the deadline that was imposed, a deadline that was arbitrary. It's not used in and has not been used in other constitutional amendments. There was no deadline. The ERA was introduced with a deadline. Congress can just boom, remove the deadline, and boom, we have equal rights in the Constitution. So if you care about this, you may want to encourage those who represent you to do the good deed. The other thing that is less known is that the United Nations has CEDAW, CEDAW, and it's basically the Declaration of Rights of Women. And the United States is the only industrialized member of the United Nations that has failed to ratify it in 2023. There are, I think, two other countries, two other nation states that members of the United Nations that have failed to ratify. We don't have a good track record, and we really need to correct it. We got to continue the fight. I think I'm sounding more like a minister than I am like a historian. Sorry about that. Passionate about what I care about. I inherited it from CEDAW. If you just Google CEDAW.
No, this
You're
is
welcome.
wonderful. I think everybody enjoys hearing you go on, and us. I feel like I've learned more. I feel like every time we do these programs, I learn more and more about the women's suffrage movement. I guess my question for you is, so I'm a mom of young kids, and what would be an easy or like distilled down way to talk to them about women's suffrage and its importance?
Talking about it and its importance
Just
to
to history. I think for like the younger generations, I feel like it's important. Like I feel so lucky to have Nancy in our community to keep talking about women's suffrage and the role that Saratoga has played And I feel like this is something that now my generation needs to emphasize and keep in the forethought for everybody.
Yeah, I I don't know about younger, but I know that I teach at Syracuse University in the honors program, and suffrage is not always a sexy topic. It's something it's done. It's something that happened. And I think that what I find is that if it's compared to something like the Equal Rights Amendment, that, how are we feeling in this moment? Is it the same thing? A lot of women assume that we have equal rights in the United States protected, and we don't. Um, were there a lot of women that didn't know that we couldn't vote? Um, well, state by state, women could vote, and there are state equal rights amendments, but that's not the same as having the federal constitutional protection. That really is solid. The state rights can be taken away, and they're not uniformly across the nation. So I think making those kind of comparisons, the thing that I've done with kids when they've been to the Gage Center is that um, I I have some kind of treat for them, and I say, okay, we've got two options here for treats. We've got brownies or we've got mud pies. Um, we've got to decide who's going to eat brownies and who's going to eat mud pies. And they're on the, of course, yeah. Oh, well, we know. I said, okay, only boys can vote. The boys, which do you prefer to eat, mud pies or brownies? Obvious answer. What about the girls? What are you going to give them to eat? Mud pies or brownies? What are you going to vote on and decide for them? Well, the girls are going to have to eat mud. And the girls now are ready to stage a, a revolution, and they do. And then they get a sense of the unfairness of it. And sometimes you turn it around and only the girls get to decide, and the boys get to feel what that is to be without a voice. And so, just simple activities can be fun.
I love that. I'm sure my 4-year-old would also make the girls eat mud pies. If there's any final questions from anybody, or if Nancy, if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to add, we have a few more minutes.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Wagner. That was so interesting. And it's lovely to hear some of the language that was used and to be able to really picture what was going on in the passages that you read us. I think it kind of brings it back. But I think you really gave us a lot to think about would we have been as suffragists? Because I don't think I've ever really thought of it that way. And I think that's really a great way to look at it, and so important because it helps us appreciate them so much more. And because it was a sacrifice in so many ways. So I just want to thank you because I certainly have learned things too. So very grateful.
Well, thank you. I really am honored and enjoyed the opportunity.
And when you come out to Saratoga, we'll have to get together and go see the markers over on Fifth Ave and down at Broadway. Oh, if we do have one more question. All right. Gloria asked, what do you feel will be the outcome of the ban on teaching some historical events to not know will the next generation just accept it?
I think that the backlash has created an even stronger, I like to think of it as a front lash. And it's the change has been so rapid and so strong that and on so many different levels that I'm 80 years old and my demographic is scared shitless by what's going on. It's really frightening. It's the world that I grew up in is no longer the world. And for people that have continued to grow into the future, it's exciting. But for people who stayed in the world in which we grew up, it's absolutely terrifying. And I think to understand where that backlash comes from, a desire to hold on to what we know, a desire to hold on to power, it 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 creates that kind of a backlash, but it's a tribute to how far we've come. And I think the front lash is now has the possibility and the potential to take us even further into the future, into a just and egalitarian um, future. So I'm hopeful at a time of um, of terrible backlash. But then I just experienced a trifecta today, so I'm on top of the world. And besides that, it's my son-in-law's birthday, and I adore him. I think he got a triple birthday present.
That does sound like a pretty good birthday present. Yeah, and Pat was just following up on that, and she said, why don't we teach this in school? If we don't teach in schools, how do young women know what's at stake?
Yeah, and we have to find creative ways to do it. One of the things that some of us in the museum world have been talking about is how can we partner with educators to tell the story in museums, because we don't have the same kind of, especially if we're privately funded, if we're if we're part of the Park Service, we may have a few more limitations on us, but how can we partner with schools to say, let's pick up the slack? How can we do what you're not able to do right now? And I think it puts, a great deal of pressure and importance on getting books out that kids can really respond to, and understand. Um,
I will jump in there to say that that's something at the National Collaborative that we're concerned about as well. And we are testing. We do have them on our website. We put together some lesson plans for this month that use the National Votes for Women Trail, so people can find something that's related to where they live or maybe their ethnicity, or do some research. But as a fifth grade teacher, it really is interesting because the kids have no idea that this wasn't always the way that the world was, and it really is interesting, and it really is important because people that boys and girls are all are like, well, that's not fair. I mean, they really get that that's not fair. So
Yeah.
you're really right. It's something that we really need to go forth. I think there really is a lack of materials right now. So I think that is something that we all need to work with. And partnering with a museum is such a great idea because it's so engaging for the students.
I might just add something quickly. I hired a group of fourth graders as junior consultants, paid them for each session, and had them go through the Gage Center, which is in Fayetteville, New York. Come and visit. The Gage home we've turned into a center for social justice dialogue. And I asked them to go through each room and say what they understood, what they didn't, what did they want to see, what's the narrative in here that would really compel you. Fourth graders are learning New York history and abolition, women's rights, and the Haudenosaunee. And when we came to the Underground Railroad room, we have themed rooms in the house, and each of Gage's social justice issues. And she offered her home as a station on the Underground Railroad. And what was really surprising was that these fourth graders thought that enslavement was something that was done. It happened a long time ago, nothing since. And they had no idea that there are more enslaved people in the world today than there have ever been, even though it's everywhere illegal. And so we're trying to figure out how can we teach fourth graders about um, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, the human trafficking that's happening today. Couldn't do it in schools.
That's why museums are so important. Okay, so we had one question from Kim. She said, I love your mention of the trifecta. What are your thoughts about the possible passage of the New York ERA?
That's something that's next year, right? It's going to be on the ballot. Does somebody know more than I do about it? I 2024, yeah. And I need to be more educated about it. If somebody knows more about it, will you jump in? I'm sort of gearing up to 2024. That's when I'll learn about it. Kim, are you online? Well, maybe we just all need to do a Google search. It's very
we go.
inclusive.
I'm on my tablet. I got confused. This is Kim.
No.
Yeah, it went through the legislature, and so it has to go for referendum next year. And it's different than there's people, I've heard pros and cons about what they think the chances are of it passing, because it adds language to the one that was, is the federal. And I have it here somewhere. It reads, no person shall be denied equal rights under the laws of this state or in any subdivision thereof based on that person's race, color, ethnicity, national origin, disability, or sex, including pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression.
Wow.
So it's the naysayers are saying there's too much there for people to not pass it given our current politics, but it's a wonderful big umbrella.
Wow, that is a front lash. Oh, good. The New York State League of Women Voters has made the ERA a focus for the next 2 years. Great. So that's who we'll look to for leadership on this. Not surprisingly.
We actually have a new initiative called the Alice Brigade.
That's great.
So,
Ken, is there anything that you could post on chat for everybody to a website or anything?
I don't
I
have
guess
any.
we just-
I'm on my tablet, so I don't really have.
we can just all check out the state league, right? Yeah, good.
Yeah.
And Kim, if you want to share to my email, you can always send it over, because I will send out a link to the recording next week. So if you have anything that you want to share in that, I'm happy to put that in the email too.
Okay.
There we go. Great.
Awesome. Any final thoughts, questions from anybody? All right. Well, Dr. Wagner, thank you so much for joining us. This was great, and I'm glad that we had such like a good conversation at the end and everything. And Nancy, thank you for coordinating all of this. And I'm glad that we were all able to spend the evening together.
Thank you.
All right, and I will do one final plug for the Historic Homes Tour, just so that everybody remembers to save the date. That is going to be on Saturday, May 13th, which is the Saturday of Mother's Day weekend. And if you are not a member yet, feel free to join us as a member. It helps us keep programs like this going, and we appreciate everyone being here tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
You.